Starting fights was not James Garner's style. In Hollywood, he was known for being composed, professional, and highly regarded by practically all of his co-workers. He was the type of performer who was punctual, knew his lines, and was polite and decency-oriented with everyone, from the director to the lighting guy. Therefore, others ought to have listened when he expressed concern about someone, but they didn't. Garner cautioned people about a particular actress who was graceful, recognizable, and a legend in her own right. He made it apparent behind closed doors that there was something off about her. And he was disregarded for years. After all, she had made a career out of being fearless, intelligent, and unavoidable, and she had won over fans and the press. She appeared to be everything that Hollywood loved. James Garner, however, had witnessed a different side of her that hardly ever showed. But when it happened, everything was different. It wasn't until years later that other performers, directors, and even staff members started to share their stories. All of a sudden, Garner's subdued caution seemed less absurd. Indeed, it began to appear that he had been correct all along. What precisely transpired between this untouchable figure and James Garner, then? What caught his attention and prompted him to speak up? And why did Hollywood take so long to accept his credibility? You have to know who James Garner was to the world in order to appreciate why her warning was so unexpected and so simple to disregard. Actress Lauren Bacall wasn't your typical one. She was a member of the Hollywood elite. She redefined what it meant to be cool, self-assured, and totally in charge from the first time she stepped onto the screen in the 1940s, with her smoky, deep voice and those iconic arched eyebrows. Everything changed after she made her debut opposite Humphrey Bogart in Have and Have Not. On and off screen, their connection was electrifying, and Bacall swiftly rose above the status of a budding star. She came to represent intrigue, power, and glitz. She was loved by critics. Fans adored her, and studios respected her. Her keen wit, her backbone, and her refusal to follow anyone's rules but her own made Bacall stand out in a field that was fixated on youth and obedience. She gained a reputation as a tough, no-nonsense woman who knew precisely what she wanted and typically got it. She went through the industry with a sort of magnetic force. She was described in interviews as refreshingly honest and ferociously brilliant. She refused to be categorized as a damsel or a sidekick, spoke her opinion, and defied convention. She was considered a feminist icon by many before the term had even gained use. However, beneath all of that glitz and glamour, there were murmurs, the kind that were never featured in magazine covers or on-air interviews. She was occasionally characterized by her co-workers as aloof, domineering, and even patronizing. Although her name carried a caution in secret circles, it was not something you would hear from her followers or witness during her performances. Quiet, subtle, and genuine. However, because Lauren Bacall was Lauren Bacall, those rumors were mostly ignored when they did come up. Being brave and unrepentant had been the cornerstones of her persona. Her self-assurance was motivating to some. Others, such as one highly regarded actor, however, saw it as something completely else. James Garner also noticed the difference. He sensed it. And he was unable to keep it to himself once they started working together. However, that was just the start. Both Lauren Bacall and James Garner were already well-known figures by the time they ended up collaborating on the same project. Garner had established his reputation with the Rockford Files and gained notoriety in Maverick for his easy charm. Everyone liked him because he was laid back, peaceful, and had a dry sense of humor that could diffuse even the most tense situations. From directors to extras, he was renowned for treating everyone with dignity on set. Garner was anchored in an egocentric town. Then came the 1981 psychological thriller The Fan, in which Garner played the role of her ex-husband and Bacall played a Broadway star who was being hounded by an obsessed fan. Garner felt that something was wrong almost immediately after production started, even though it should have been a seamless cooperation between two seasoned pros. The friction between the two was not explosive, according to those with knowledge of the production. On the outside, it was discreet, professional, and chilly, but below there was a silent friction that was hard to miss. Garner was accustomed to family-like sets. Bacall offered something new. She was exacting, demanding, and occasionally contemptuous of anybody who didn't live up to her expectations or questioned her authority. Although she didn't shout, her enthusiasm could make the entire room tense. For his part, Garner never engaged in power disputes or attempted to overshadow her. He wasn't like that. When things wasn't working, though, he didn't pretend either. It appeared that Bacall was not really interested in changing her strategy to promote unity. She ensured that everyone was aware of her rank. Some crew members started talking behind closed doors. During blocking, there were whispers that Bacall was altering lines on set or challenging the director's authority. Despite his reluctance to cause trouble, Garner was becoming more and more irritated, not because he required special treatment, but rather because the work itself was deteriorating. Later, without explicitly mentioning names, he would allude to how awful the encounter had been. However, others who knew him and the set knew exactly who he was talking about. Bacall's demeanor has affected not only him but also a number of other people who worked on the movie. To make matters worse, Bacall failed to recognize the issue. She saw it as being straightforward, professional, and efficient, but Garner saw it as something quite different. Throughout his career, he has dealt with a wide range of individuals, including strong-willed, introverted, daring, and quirky. However, what he observed in Bacall was not confidence but rather control, not the sort that commands respect, but the kind that alienates others. Garner would not remain silent indefinitely, but for the moment he kept most of it to himself. People were never known to be thrown under the bus by James Garner. He was reticent, courteous, and nearly intolerant of rumors. Therefore, it meant something when he did mention someone, even in passing. Years after they collaborated on The Fan, he eventually expressed his opinions about Lauren Bacall, and they were scathing. He never made a full-scale attack on Bacall in his memoir, The Garner Files. He made it apparent that their time together had been, in his own words, challenging, but that was not his style. He characterized her as shrewd, defensive, and prone to despise people around her. He didn't mention names or make allegations, but it was clear that her actions had made an impression, and a bad one. Working with her was like walking on eggshells, he recalled. She was impatient with compromise and expected things to go her way. Her approach was exhausting to Garner, who valued kindness and teamwork. Not only was her behavior bothering him, but so was the ease with which others could overlook it. People ignored what was happening in front of them because of her reputation, beauty, and prestige. And that was nothing out of the ordinary in Hollywood. Powerful people have a long history of being pardoned for actions that no one else would tolerate, particularly if they had a stellar CV and a following of devoted followers that spanned decades. There were no headlines or negative reactions to Garner's comments. The majority of people actually ignored them. After all, Bacall was a legend. She had married Humphrey Bogart, collaborated with the greatest, and devoted her professional life to being fearless and unrepentant. It was frequently interpreted as a sign of weakness or jealousy if someone complained about her. Garner, however, had nothing to demonstrate. He didn't harbor resentment. He had no plans. He was only being straightforward and honest, like he always had been. Perhaps that's why it was so simple to overlook. He wasn't yelling from rooftops or giving the media press leaks. All he was doing was subtly cautioning the next person in line, hoping that their experience would be less complicated than his. Regretfully, the majority of people did not heed his warning, and they most likely ought to have since it became evident that Garner had not been alone as the stories began to mount. The majority of people recall The Fan as a low-key thriller that was creepy, fashionable, and supported by Lauren Bacall's strong presence. However, the tension that was boiling just out of frame was never visible to the public. Behind them, something much less glamorous was happening while the cameras rolled. Co-stars rarely shook James Garner, an experienced actor who had collaborated with everyone from Steve McQueen to Julie Andrews. Nevertheless, he was walking a tightrope on the Fan set. Despite never being explicitly antagonistic, Bacall produced a tense atmosphere that permeated the entire set. Instructions became orders, and conversations were sniped. Additionally, the attitude was frequently cold or contemptuous to anyone attempting to make recommendations or ideas, particularly if they questioned her authority. Later, crew members spoke of a difficult-to-ignore dynamic. Bacall insisted on having authority over the production's energy as well as her scenes. She resisted rewrites, questioned direction, and was known to overturn judgments that didn't align with her vision. Mostly keeping his frustration to himself, Garner, who valued efficiency and harmony, conveyed a distinct message with his body language and a few words. Rumors circulated at one point that Bacall and Edward Bianchi, the film's director, were at odds. Insiders suggested that Bacall's insistence on doing things her way slowed down production and caused conflicts within the crew, although the specifics were never disclosed. Always professional, Garner tried to maintain his objectivity, but it was clear he wasn't having fun. Bacall's ability to toggle the charm on and off like a switch added complexity. She came across to the media as self-assured and humorous. She could come out as judgmental, domineering, and aloof to the actors and crew. Working with someone like that, according to Garner, is like being in a frigid room with a temperature that never fluctuates. The clash was not a fierce one. It was the silent kind that gradually wears people down. These were not big outbursts that were captured on film or featured in gossip magazines. A vivid image of what was going on was provided by the minor moments, side remarks, silences, and snubs. They were also the kind of conflicts that, although they don't often make the news, people who experience them never forget. Garner learned a lesson from the event. Occasionally, the most profound impressions are not made by the loudest arguments. It's the silent ones, and he would soon learn that he wasn't alone in feeling that cold. It wasn't just James Garner who left Lauren Bacall with a shaky sensation. A number of actors and insiders have subtly expressed similar opinions over the years. Stories that passed in private chats, green rooms, and dressing rooms but rarely made headlines. Bacall's handling of other people's strong personalities was one of the most revealing trends. She made it quite evident that no one intimidated her. Her confidence was viewed as confrontational, even belligerent, by some, while others respected it. Bacall was notorious for pushing limits with directors and arguing with co-stars who didn't share her fervor on stage, especially during her Broadway years. Theater insiders claim that Bacall's insistence on managing the performance her way caused tension during rehearsals for some productions, not due to inexperience or artistic disagreements. The heat was felt even by seasoned artists. According to reports, one performer who had co-starred with her in a revival left the show in the middle, claiming irreconcilable creative differences, a term that frequently conceals much deeper personal strife. There were rumors that cooperation had become a battleground due to Bacall's quest for dominance. The incident contributed to the subdued legend surrounding her behind-the-scenes demeanor, even though it was never officially confirmed. In an interview, actress Brenda Vaccaro, who was in the same industry, implied that Bacall might be hard to please when she wasn't the center of attention. Although she never gave names, it was obvious who she was referring to given the situation and date. Working with Bacall could be draining, even for those who quietly appreciated her skill. According to one unnamed stage performer, she was excellent, but when she entered, she had a knack of making the atmosphere feel lighter. Then there was the issue of old pals who became distant co-workers. Eventually, some of Bacall's closest industry connections ended, not because of scandal or treachery, but just because maintaining ties came at too great an emotional cost. Yes, she might be devoted, but she could also be demanding, domineering, and quite critical. According to a friend from her early years, she was the type of person who would never let you forget any slights, no matter how minor. This cautious edge was evident even in her interviews. Although Bacall frequently talked about honesty, it was selective honesty. In one instance, she told a reporter that most actresses never had to struggle as hard as I did, demonstrating her tendency to criticize others without hesitation. It was an insightful remark about her perspective and how she evaluated other people. It seems that Bacall had to gain respect the hard way. It wasn't always freely offered, even back then. A broader picture emerges when you examine these testimonies collectively, taking into account the tense situations on stage, the strained friendships, and the silent remarks made by actors who have experienced it. Garner's voice was not alone. He joined a silent chorus of those who had been through the same cold front. The pattern was indisputable, even though none of them yelled it from the rooftops. And soon, even Bacall's admirers would be unable to ignore that trend as it caught up with her reputation. Something unexpected started to happen as the years went by and Lauren Bacall's career gained less attention. It was the quiet honesty of time, not a scandal or media frenzy, that caused the perfectly controlled image she had spent decades cultivating to begin to crumble. The formerly unspoken facts about Bacall grew increasingly difficult to deny as more autobiographies were released, more interviews were made public, and more business veterans thought back on their experiences. More than anybody had expected, James Garner subtly warned that she was not as simple to work with as her polished persona implied started to ring true. Other collaborators started talking more openly in the years following The Fan. Previously silent directors talked about the difficulties of working with Bacall, pointing out her rigidity and propensity to control a show. According to one director, she was intelligent but unyielding, and she didn't know how to compromise. Her following interviews started to sound different, even to her fans. Bacall's remarks about Hollywood became more sour as she grew older. She called herself one of the few authentic actresses, disparaged contemporary stars, and rejected up-and-coming talent. Some saw something else, while others applauded her defiance. An unwillingness to change and a contempt for those who had not experienced her time. It wasn't limited to print. Bacall frequently came across as aloof or contemptuous during late career interviews and award show appearances, ignoring questions or correcting presenters in the middle of sentences. People were offended because what was once perceived as confidence was now interpreted as superiority. Her mystery quietly gave way to a more nuanced reality. This was followed by the retrospectives. Film historians' perspective on Bacall became more complex as they started to re-examine Hollywood's heyday. Of course, she was still praised. Although there was no denying her skill, presence, and impact, the image of the untouchable Queen of Cool was replaced by a more nuanced one. It's possible that a woman who had battled valiantly for her position in the profession lost the affection of people around her. No one ever gloated over James Garner. "I told you so" was never his words. He wasn't like that. But the pieces started to come together for those who had remembered his warning and had read between the lines of his narrative. He had been the first to see it. The power struggles, the emotional detachment, and the covert drive to dominate any space she entered. Garner's modest fact contrasted with Bacall's imposing myth in a town where reputations are crucial. And the fact that he had nothing to gain by speaking it just strengthened its impact. He wasn't looking for publicity or retribution. He just couldn't act as though it hadn't occurred. People were now able to glimpse the big picture thanks to hindsight. James Garner never made a scene in the end. He never wrote a dramatic expose, never tried to damage anyone's reputation, and never voiced his complaints on talk shows. He refused to pretend, yet that was not who he was. His encounter with Lauren Bacall was memorable not because it was terrible or explosive, but rather because it subtly revealed the price of working with someone who prioritized power over interpersonal relationships. There is more to Garner's story than a single awkward movie set. It has to do with Hollywood's bigger reality. Legends are not always what they seem, and that image frequently obscures reality. Bacall's status as a fearless, unyielding symbol remained uncontested for many years. Her strength, her defiance, and her fire were lauded. However, the potential for that same fire to burn those around her was frequently disregarded. She was challenging, but she was neither a villain nor evil. Additionally, hardship can leave scars. Garner felt it, he saw it, and he just decided to be honest rather than attack. Over time, the quiet honesty outperformed any headline in terms of impact. Perhaps that's why this story is so interesting. The fact that one of Hollywood's most likable performers noticed something that others decided to overlook, not the drama or the stress. And he spoke in a whisper rather than a roar, not to undermine anyone but because someone had to say the truth. Therefore, consider what the well-known actor is truly trying to convey the next time you hear them make a subdued remark, raise a mild red flag, or share a story that deviates from the mainstream storyline. Because no one took James Garner's warning seriously.